So in coaching, one polarity that exists in almost all coaches is permissiveness and authoritarianism, right? And for some of us, it exists in both of us quite often. Now, permissive coaches are coaches who tolerate and allow players to not give their best, or they fail to challenge players to raise their standard to the standard that we desire, right? To push themselves harder. Well, the defense of permissiveness, the rationale or the reasons we are permissive are we need to win. We want to get through practice without conflict. Or we got to get through this practice to be ready for Friday. Other times it's things like we want to be liked, or we don't want to be the jerk that we experienced as a coach. We want our kids to be happy, to have fun. Another one I hear is we shouldn't have to get on them about certain behaviors. Another one is we don't want our kids to quit, or we don't want to lose our job, or we don't want to hurt their mental health. And hey, we also get it. They're tired, and they're just kids. They're humans. They make mistakes. They're going to have bad days. Other ones that I hear are, well, hey, I'm not quite sure that they're not meeting the standard. I don't have proof. I need proof. These are just many of the popular reasons, the excuses, or justifications that we make as coaches for allowing, tolerating, or accepting behaviors that we know are not meeting our team standard. And yet oftentimes these are short-sighted. As the author and psychiatrist, the author of the dopamine effect, Anna Lemke says, empathy without accountability is a short-sighted attempt to relieve suffering. Empathy without accountability is a short-sighted attempt to relieve suffering. Now, let's go over to the other side of the polarity here, which is authoritarian old school coaches. Coaches who yell at their athletes, who yell at the team, who blow up on their team, who lecture them at halftime and after games. Sometimes these are coaches who are aggressive in their tone or body language. Coaches who threaten and punish their athletes when they mess up or do the wrong thing. Coaches who shame their athletes. Well, these coaches, or myself included in this at times when I'm in that authoritarian mode or style, our thinking is often that our athletes are soft and they need to be toughened up, or we need to break them down to build them up again. Or kids these days, they need discipline. There's also the argument that we need to win to keep our job, and we need to challenge our players and get after them. And the bottom line is it works. Like when I yell at them or bark at them, when I put them on the line and run them, they listen, they shape up, they work harder. Now, while these are popular reasons, excuses, or justifications for old school coaching, most of these methods, well, they're short-sighted as well. They are short-sighted attempts to change behavior. They fail to lead in lasting behavior change, even if it changes for, that practice or that week, or even the rest of this time, the season, or the time that an athlete plays for us. Because in the end, these are attempts to change behavior. They fail to build character, to build intrinsic motivation to do the right thing for the right reasons, and the life skills necessary to do the right thing when others aren't holding us accountable. So whether you struggle with being permissive, or you struggle with being authoritarian, or you are like myself and swing between the two on a daily basis, today's episode is going to show you the way forward, a way to navigate this polarity. The third way, the transformational discipline way, the way that doesn't just get short-term behavior change, but that changes the very mindset and helps to truly discipline, to teach, to develop character and nurture intrinsic motivation into doing the right thing. Welcome to Coaching Culture Podcast. I'm JP Nurbin, and I'm joined by my co-hosts Nate Sinderson and Betsy Butterick. Our mission here is simple. We want to help coaches become better leaders and build better team cultures. If you're interested in learning more about our work as leadership coaches and facilitators, or if you want to explore our online courses and books, head on over to tocculture.com and betsybutterick.com. While you're at tocculture.com, don't forget to subscribe to our weekly newsletter. It's packed with notes from each podcast episode, our latest articles, and practical culture building tips. Also, just one more thing before we get into today's episode. This is a great one to share with your coaching team. Share it, have a conversation about it, get vulnerable and tell them something that you need to work at when it comes to the way that you discipline and hold them accountable, and get them to start to think about transformational discipline as well. Now, let's get started with today's conversation. All right, the gang is back together, and we have been long waiting this episode that I have kind of been thinking about for a couple months, because it is probably one of the most common challenges that I work with coaches on, that I'm coaching, but also I'm starting to experience some challenges myself when it comes to coaching my daughter's under nines football team and my son's under sevens football team. So some of this might be some coaching and some advice giving for me as I work through some of those challenges. But really, we're going to talk about today is a discipline and accountability. And it doesn't matter if you have a pro team, a college team, a high school team, or you're coaching a bunch of 6-year-olds as I am. We all know that there needs to be structure and discipline within practices, within games, within the team, for us not only to be successful in our performance or learning, but just for the overall experience of everyone in that environment. So it's a really important thing. But how do we do that, right? I see so many coaches, we just resort to our default reactions of how maybe we were parented, how we were coached. And so today we are going to talk about maybe some of the common pitfalls that coaches experience. And then we're actually going to really take and break down some common scenarios or behaviors that coaches need to discipline and hold athletes accountable in. And we're going to kind of coach our listeners through those scenarios. So let's get started with this, Betsy and Nate. When you look at accountability and discipline, where do coaches get this wrong?
Well, JP, we were talking a little bit about this off air here. I think that there's this polarity sometimes for coaches, at least what I see and oftentimes what I hear is that, on the one end, there's something goes wrong and the coach is just going to go ballistic. We're going to get on the line. There's going to be an immediate punishment. The whole team's, potentially going to be punished for the transgressions of one player. And with the hope, of course, that now the rest of the team will be motivated to do the job that I probably should be doing myself as the coach, right, through that peer pressure. So, there's that end of it, the flying off the handle. And then all the way on the other end of that perspective is the coach that just sort of looks the other way and hopes it goes away, and there are seasons, plenty of seasons, especially early in my career where that was, Mr. Conflict Avoidance over here. That was me 100%. Like I'd hear about things, I'd see things. I might talk to a captain. I might say something to an assistant coach. I'd probably complain about it to my wife. But I would, at the end of the day, just hope we could get through it, hope it would go away, hope it wouldn't torpedo our season. And quite frankly, having tried both of those, they're not the most effective out there, I don't believe.
Nate, I've got a lot of empathy for what you just said, because I see something very similar from a lot of coaches. And to double down on the challenge, what I observe often is coaches feel challenged by both time and capacity. So the time it takes to identify first for themselves as a staff, as a program, what are our negotiables or non-negotiables? What basic standards have to be in place? What is it that we are wanting to and willing to address every time it happens? Because the consistency piece is where I see a lot of the accountability fall apart. Like you said, Nate, like things happen, and then all of a sudden coach gets really pissed and everybody's on the line because now we're going to lean into accountability. It's like, well, what happened to the other moments a couple of days ago where the same thing happened, but they look the other way? So operating in those two polarities that you mentioned. The other thing I see is when a coach maybe is consistent in discipline or accountability around certain areas, but to the players, those certain areas are not the most important. So I'm going to get on a kid for not wearing the right shirt, or team attire when we're traveling, but I'm not going to get on an individual who happens to be my best player, who was also disrespectful to another member of the coaching staff and the whole team side. So it's like, what are you going to be really intentional about? Do you have the energetic capacity and ability to be consistent with noticing that? And then what's the time it's going to take to really set the stage for consistent behavior over time throughout your season? So time, energetic capacity, consistency, those are the big ones that I see as challenges for coaches of all sports.
Yeah, and I think for me, I would go down to, there's a lot of, we could talk about, well, coaches do this, they don't do this, certain behaviors or lack of, things they don't do. But I would really look at, for me, the coach's mindset when it comes to discipline. They operate from a place of, well, I shouldn't have to, right? Like I was even thinking myself today about my daughter's team. Well, these parents should be teaching their kids to listen. I mean, I teach my daughter to listen, right? Like, well, I shouldn't have to be on them about listening, right? And then you go up the ranks and you go to college coaches, the same thing. Oh, I shouldn't have to teach them this. We're at Division I level here. Like, right? I shouldn't have to. I have coaches that don't actually hold their other coaches accountable because they go, well, I shouldn't have to. They're an adult, right? So there's this whole belief that we shouldn't have to, or to your point, Betsy, I don't have the time to do that. We have to win a game on Friday. And the reality is that's a mistaken belief, because if you don't have the time now, then it's going to just cost you down the line. The other mindset, and this is, I would say, really probably the root of most really failed attempts to discipline well, is that coaches have the mindset that they have successfully had an intervention of disciplined or held an athlete accountable when they see behavior change. Just the change of behavior alone is success. And that is where so often coaches rely on putting teams in a line and running them, yelling at your team, or whatever it is that you use that blow up that emotional, you know, shaming, blaming, right? That type of coaching. Well, because it works, JP, it works. I see them work harder when I do that. And it works harder in the short term, but it doesn't work hard in the long term. Why? Because you haven't addressed the mindset of the player. The mindset still is the same, right? They're only doing what you asked them to do because you told them to do it, or there would be a punishment right at the end of the line. And so what coaches really need to work at is having a mindset of like, what's really going on here? How do I actually help the athlete not just change their behavior, but change their mindset, right? Change what's really going on for them that's keeping them from doing what they need to do.
Yeah, a couple things come up for me in what you just mentioned, JP. One is, I heard this quote years ago, and it was from an educational space, and it said, the individuals most in need of love will ask for it in the most unloving ways. And so anytime I see behavior that is just like, whoa, what is going on? My first question is like, okay, where's the pain? Or like, what's going on for that individual where they feel the need to behave in this way? And then what you said about behavior change, when I talk to coaches about yelling, and we know that yelling is not the most effective way, and not yelling over space because you coach an outdoor sport, yelling with the purpose of shaming, blaming, intimidating, demeaning, because you do get that immediate behavior change. And it's so reinforcing for coaches that are yellers. They know all I have to do is yell, and then I'm going to see a change of behavior, and I'm going to get more of what I want. And to your point, like a fear state is not a flow state. Long term, we're not going to get optimal performance from the behavior change that we're seeing in the short term. And so this is a big challenge. And I think mindset is not an area. When I talk with coaches about discipline, about accountability, mindset is a word that's rarely mentioned. And so I think you hit on a great point of how do we think about discipline? Even the word discipline, the word punishment. Okay, when you hear those words, what are some of the associations that you immediately make? Like I think about, being raised in a different generation where kids were spanked. That was very common. It's like we hit our kids. Now, if you talk about hitting your kids, it's like CPS is immediately called. So it's different context. But what's your mindset around discipline, your mindset around accountability, your own experience of it? I think that is a fantastic starting place for coaches when it comes to doing this type of work, and not something they often think about. So I'm really glad you brought that into the conversation.
JP, another thing when I look at my own experience that has kept me from evolving really for the first half of my career is simply, well, two things. One, I had no exposure to any other way. I mean, my natural tendency was to just hope things go away and, not stir the pot necessarily. And, I was coached or parented by, people that would get after me if we did something wrong. Right. And so, I think there's a lack of skill and a lack of what that actually feels like, because most of us in our generation have not experienced a different kind of discipline or a different approach to accountability. I know that's the reason we're having this conversation, but I do think that there's, an angle here that is a bit fair to say, like, if you haven't seen another way, if you haven't experienced another way, it would be a little bit foolish for us to just assume that you should know, hey, there's a different way to go about this.
Yeah. And now, before we get into some of these, we'll call them case studies, scenarios that we want to walk through that are common behavioral challenges, I just want to lay down a few more things that help us to have this conversation. And I might even cover these in the intro later. But first off, when we're talking about here, I think is, we all want to be transformational coaches. So we go back to, what is our purpose in coaching? Why are we coaching? We have to start from that place. So everyone here as a listener, I mean, we're operating from the space of, we want to have some sort of positive impact on our athletes that lasts beyond just this moment or this season, right? So we're all agreeing to that. I think it's also important we get clear on just some language and some terminology that we hear often. One is this idea around punishment, okay, and consequence. And I think people get confused. It's something I cover about in the book, The Culture System. But punishment, the best way to say is, I'm doing it to the athlete. I'm doing it to you. I'm punishing you. Whereas a consequence is something they've done to themselves. And I think that will really make a lot more sense when we talk about, okay, this is what punishment looks like in this scenario. This is what a consequence would look like. There's oftentimes with the consequence, I would say there's a conversation with the consequence, right? There's probably more of a lecture or an ultimatum or some directive given with a punishment. It's just like, this is it, right? So the consequence involves this conversation. Now, there's two main consequences we'll talk about today, which are natural consequences and logical consequences. Natural consequences are, my kid, forgets to bring her umbrella to school, and I allow her to walk home and get wet, right? That's a natural consequence of forgetting to bring her umbrella, right? There's natural consequences. We don't work hard in a drill, we don't get better, right? Players don't treat each other well, we don't enjoy the season. The logical consequences are things that are more solution-based orientated, that we've typically have agreed upon. And Dr. Jane Nelson, she gives 4 criteria of a consequence. They're related to the behavior. They're respectful. It should be, maintain the dignity and respect of the individual. It's reasonable, right? It's proportionate to the behavior, and then it's revealed in advance. And I think that as much as possible, that is an important aspect of it as well too, right? We've clearly communicated consequences beforehand. So that way it really does feel like they've chosen it themselves, right? They've chosen that consequence. So that's a little bit of just a background before we kind of jump into these case studies. All right, so let's kick off probably with what is most relevant for me right now, and that is talking while a coach is speaking. It's a bit of a problem with our under 9s girls. It is a huge problem with 6-year-old boys, and especially on Friday afternoons at 6 o'clock when they've been cooped up in school all week. So Betsy, Nate, help me with this. How would you handle athletes, regardless of age? Maybe age brings a bit of is a bit of a factor in how you might handle it, but how would you handle athletes that are talking while a coach is speaking?
Well, JP, I think age and stage is relevant. I'm also in this season of working with 4th and 5th grade girls right now for basketball. And we just had an episode the other day where I'm trying to give some instructions to get us into a game. And one particular player just keeps talking. And after 1, 2, 3 reminders and just asking her just to wait on her conversation for another 30 seconds so I could finish, she wouldn't. And so I just paused and I said, Skylar, I'm going to have to ask you to sit in the doorway over here and listen to the rest of the instructions, because this isn't fair to your teammates that are trying to get the information so we can get into this game. They want to play the game, and this is delaying our time. And the look on everyone's faces was like, their eyes were wide. They couldn't have believed that somebody was asked to go to the door and sit apart from everyone else. But it wasn't done in anger. It wasn't done in punishment. She got to participate in the game. And eventually we would circle back to, why does that matter? And I think that's an interesting lens as we talk through a lot of these scenarios that has been helpful for me. Is it does annoy me. It's super irritating. My heart rate goes up and the rage monster starts to, crawl out a little bit when that happens. But at the end of the day, it's really just not fair to our teammates. And that's where I really try to root myself in a very calm way, just to address it. And here's the natural consequence, like, because we can't have you talking while everyone else, or while I am, and we're going to move on. And I don't hold against her, I'm not holding a grudge or anything like that. And so that maybe doesn't work with everybody, but in that particular case, it was good for us.
Yeah, Nate, I think what you hit on there was that you just explained why, and you kept yourself regulated. What I'm doing with my daughter's team and what I'm doing with the under 7s team is I've tried to establish the consequence beforehand and communicate it not just to the athletes, but to the parents. And we'll put it in the parent group chat, because a lot of parents come and watch the practice. And oh my gosh, my daughter's sitting out for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, or she's gone to go grab a drink of water and nobody else has done that. Well, why is that? And as I explained to them, I explained, well, why it's important. It's important so they can get better, so they can have fun. The team can get better and the team can have fun. And I also say always, so I don't lose my mind, right? So I can keep enjoying coaching you all here. So I always explain why. And I say, no, if you are talking, right, I might give you a look. You're still struggling, I might just ask you to step out, maybe go get a drink of water, come back and reset yourself, right? That's what we're rolling with currently here. The thing I just hearing you talk and Betsy talk earlier reminds myself is my mindset. My mindset affects how I react emotionally in that moment. So often I see, oh, here's another problem. This is disruptive. No, here's an opportunity. Here's an opportunity. That's the thing I probably need to remind myself the most. Our next one is a common one, and that is being late to practice. Coaches have this happen at all levels, right? And some at the earlier levels is probably a little bit more parent dependent. But Betsy, how would you address this?
Yeah, for me, context matters always. So late. And I even think I was on a flight last night and we left late from one location. And so I was late to my connection and missed the connecting flight home and had to take a later flight. So there's a lot of lateness that happened, all of which was fairly uncontrollable by me. So when it comes to players being late to practice, setting an expectation of, look, there are going to be certain situations that are out of our control that cause us to be late for practice. When those arise, here are the expectations for communication. Letting us know when you're going to be late, even if it's, oh my gosh, I overslept. My alarm didn't go off. I'm going to be late to practice. Like as soon as you're going to be late, here's how we expect you to communicate and to whom we expect you to communicate. That's a different context than, yeah, I was just late. Like didn't feel like coming on time. I had other stuff to do. I wanted to finish a conversation. So identifying the context as it relates to tardiness, I think is important. Outlining expectations for when late happens, how we're going to handle late, and then leaning into, based on context, those natural consequences or different consequences that are appropriate for the situation. So the reality is, as a team, if everyone's not there at the start of practice, we can't learn together until we're all in the same space. So because your individual lateness kept us from doing what we would otherwise do as a team, there needs to be an appropriate related consequence. So maybe the immediate consequence for you personally is you missed an opportunity to learn what we were talking about to get better at your skills. The additional consequence is because you kept the team from being able to do what we could have otherwise done, now you don't get an opportunity when the team competes to play as much as you would have. So if it's, 4 quarters of a basketball game, you're not going to play in the first quarter in a space that you otherwise might have because you were late. So trying to teach, and then I think about the teaching part and it's like, okay, depending on the reason why the individual is late, can we also teach, okay, it sounds like it's a challenge for you to do this. What needs to be true in order for you to set yourself up to be on time more consistently? So can we not just address the late or dole out consequences for the late in the moment, but can we look, there's this quote about, like it's one thing to pull people out of the river. It's another to go upstream and learn why they're continually falling in. So can we go upstream with our student athletes and identify like, all right, what is it about your current way of being that is resulting in you being late that has consequences both for you and for our team?
One thing I'd add to that, JP, when Betsy talks about, again, fairness to the team, we can't do what we wanted to if we're a person short or 5 players short or whatever. Having that conversation ahead of time, here's why it's important to be on time, because we're dependent on each other for X, Y, and Z. And I think, too often coaches assume that because their parents should be teaching that or whatever. And yet when we don't really talk about the effect it has on the team in front of, the transgression, I think it just makes it a little bit harder then to come back and give the lecture where you were thinking it the whole time and never necessarily communicated it to players or even to parents about why it really matters for them to get there when they need to be.
Yeah, and consistency, conversations, communication beforehand is really what oftentimes can even change one thing from a punishment to a consequence, right? I think so often if someone's late, the natural default is some sort of physical punishment, right? You're going to run, you're going to do push-ups for every minute you're late, or we're going to blame and shame the athlete. We're going to kind of make a big stink about it and have a big lecture to the team, around why it's important to be on time, right? Whereas what you all talked about is a conversation beforehand where you said, hey, this is the natural consequence of you being late. It's disruptive. You miss opportunities. One thing that I'm trying to do, because I'm coaching young kids and they're reliant on their parents, I'm just trying to actually increase the natural consequences of them being late. So what do? We actually always start at 6 o'clock and we're always doing skill work and we're always getting better. And then we move into something that's really, really fun at around 6:05 or 6:10. And so it's like they want to be there, right? And then I'm encouraging parents, right? So it's just we're going to start on time. We're not going to wait. We're going to hold the standard there. And we're going to make the natural consequences probably greater for showing up late, right? So they're going to miss out on those things that they would want to do. And then also reflecting on the natural consequences. So players that are struggling at that age to play well, it's like, hey, one of the things that I notice is you start really slow in the game, but then you pick it up by the third or fourth quarter. But I'm also noticing you're the last one here almost every day, right? You're coming in a few minutes late. We ask you to be here at this time. What do you think about that? And then just having that conversation. This is support, and we can do this support and the support you talked about, Betsy and Nate there, and still hold them accountable. I think some logical consequences around being late. For me, it was, hey, if you're late and you haven't communicated and there's not a good reason, you don't practice the rest of the day. You lost the opportunity to practice. That's a heavy end of the spectrum there that I took for a few years. I don't know if I'd always take it. I took that for a high school team. We didn't have problems with people being late, okay? And we appreciated practices. Practices were intense. It was a whole mindset shift that goes deep. I did not want to use physical conditioning as a consequence because my big consequence was losing the privilege, the opportunity. I wanted to shift their mindset from one of I have to I get to. The other type of logical consequence I see around being late that I encourage coaches to do is just go solutions based. If you missed, well, what did you miss? How can you make it up? Like if you miss school, you have to do makeup work, right? So it's simply, sometimes it's them watching practice on recording. Sometimes it's doing a little bit of extra conditioning, getting extra shots in. But it's not just conditioning to conditioning. It's like, well, what were we doing during that time? We were shooting. So it's okay, let's do stuff like that. So that athlete has to stay late or come in early the next day to do some makeup work. So those might be some other logical consequences as well for coaches to consider, because I know being late's a big one.
And let me just add one little thing there, JP. Be very creative in how they make up that time. Like we'll have players have to read a John Gordon book and do a one-page summary. We'll have them, they have to volunteer to go to a youth practice and help the coaches there. We'll have them contribute to a scouting report, for the upcoming, because look, you missed the first 30 minutes. So you need to watch the first half of this game and send me your thoughts on what you think should be on the scouting report. But it doesn't have to be punishment in the sense of we're just taking something out of their legs or their lungs that isn't productive. It can also be extra work that still helps them to grow or to develop in some way.
Absolutely love that. Great point, Nate. Okay, so the next one we're going to jump to here is poor body language. Poor body language. I think this is so often a reflection for coaches of their frustration with players that are too emotional and can't handle their emotions. So what are some ways that coaches can discipline, hold their athletes accountable while supporting them when they demonstrate poor body language?
For me, this starts with awareness. And oftentimes for coaches too, they are not yet aware of what they are communicating with their body in the moments where they're not speaking. So for me, it starts with awareness. And probably before that, it's a conversation of, hey, one thing we're going to be intentional about is having good body language. Now, what does that mean when we say good body language? What does it look like? What does it not look like? Why does it matter? And why are we making it something that we're going to focus on in how we play and perform as a team? So starting with the foundational understanding of why body language, and then starting to build awareness. Some individuals, and it's shocking, especially when you look at coaches, and I love watching, sports on TV because body language is on display in a very big way, especially when they zoom in with like the high def cameras. Understanding that there are across sport in different contexts, things that are helpful and things that are not helpful or less helpful. So if our goal is to win, then we need to set ourselves up for success in how we compete. Part of that is our response or reaction to adversity, which often we see in the form of body language. So thinking through, for us as a coach, what is my initial response when an individual makes a mistake, when we are not in a great situation? What am I saying when I'm not speaking? but also for coaches to ask the question, when you see poor body language in an athlete, what are you making it mean? Are you making it mean that they're selfish? Are you making it mean that they're not invested? Are you making it mean that they've taken themselves out of the game? Because I think sometimes that's where we miscommunicate is as coaches, we make poor body language mean something that it doesn't actually mean for the athlete. So having that conversation, sometimes I'll do an activity where the team's in a circle and I'll say, okay, we're gonna go around the room and I'm gonna stand in front of each one of you and I'm gonna say one word, and that word is fail. When I say fail, I want you to assume the body posture or model the body language that you feel you typically do in a moment of failure. And it's a fun activity because sometimes people model something and their team's like, oh my gosh, yeah, you always do that. Sometimes you see players model something that they don't routinely do. And that speaks to, okay, either a low level of awareness or this individual wants to respond differently, but maybe doesn't yet understand how. So articulating the why of bad or poor body language, why it's important to have good body language, how it lends itself to competitive success. What are we making it mean? What does our body language look like as coaches? And then also how we can give them choices. So are we able to, in moments where we see poor body language, instead of saying, hey, pick your head up, or hey, you need to fix your body language, can we pause, create awareness of like, notice what you're doing with your body right now? Okay, what would be a more helpful body position or posture to take given what you want to achieve next? Like creating opportunities to build awareness, create shared understanding, and then move closer towards more of the body language we'd like to see consistently.
JP, this is one where I've really changed a lot of my thinking and perspective on body language in the last 20 years of coaching here. I mean, I used to be as sensitive to that probably as most coaches when somebody's shoulders are drooping or they're, whatever their facial expressions are. I think what I have realized, and this is a bit to Betsy's point here, is that body language is really the manifestation of something deeper. And when I started being curious about what that deeper thing was that is causing this exterior, appearance that's affecting our teammates and whatever, that has totally unlocked my ability to coach in those moments. Because again, I might be pissed off and be frustrated with how they're acting or carrying on, but there's something else going on. It's not just a matter of smile, even if you don't feel like smiling, or run hard, even if you don't feel like running hard. I want to know what's going on internally. What are they telling themselves? How are they feeling in that moment? Are they aware of their inner dialogue? Do they even know what the trigger was that caused them to have this kind of reaction? Because until they can build even that awareness of kind of what's going on underneath the surface for them, all we're doing is policing a facial expression or shoulders. I don't want to do that. I want them to figure out what's really going on and try to help give them support to be able to self-regulate, and to be able to handle those emotions and those feelings and those failures and those difficult moments on their own. I mean, isn't that what being a transformational coach means?
Yeah, I just think about letting athletes feel all their emotions all the way to completion, as the conscious leadership group says, like letting them feel those emotions, being so important in our work with them. Doesn't mean we don't hold a standard, but it looks a lot different than JP of the past. JP of the past was an athlete, had poor body language. It'd be like, get him out of there, pull him out, get out of there, and then pull him out of there. Your body language is totally acceptable, right? Sit down over there on the edge of the bench. Like 4 minutes later, is he good? Is he ready? Okay. If you get out there and if you have bad body language, you're coming right off again, right? Good body language, get in there, right? Like that was me, right? Like I was just so lecture. I set the standard. I'm hold the standard. No support, right? We have to find ways to support. What Betsy's talking about is conversations before the conversation, right? There's going to be a conversation, but if we've had conversations beforehand, we've taught them, had conversation around what good body language is, or even just one-on-ones. I remember one coach that I remember talking with once, and he had this word blindfold for his athletes, right? He had gone down deep, like the player had talked about, his body language goes poor. It's like he's blindfolded with anger. And so all this coach had to say was, hey, blindfold, take off the blindfold, right? And like that became like a way to reset himself. Other coaches I know, they've worked with athletes to, hey, there is like the body language is poor. What do I need? I need to come out. I need to get a drink of water. I need to do some breathing. I need to reset myself, right? That's the consequence, right? That's a consequence, right? That we enforce it with them, but it's very solution based. And I think this is one where if we want to have lasting change in someone's behavior, we have to get to the mindset here more than anything, right? there is obviously a mindset issue around whatever they're experiencing and how they're viewing failure, their mistakes, those types of things. So this, more than any of the other ones we've even talked about, I think really we have to focus on the mindset, not just the behavior, what we see externally.
But JP, just to Betsy's point about awareness too, like I do think with bad body language, and there's probably some other issues that you can have a little bit of fun with before they become big issues. So I just want to highlight 3 things that have been really fun for our team that have created good conversations. Number one, we've done a bad body language scrimmage like over Christmas break, where everybody writes down on a note card like a description of somebody, slump shoulders, complaining about the referees, talk back to your coach, whatever. People draw a card out and we play a quarter of basketball and you play that role, and then we watch the film, whatever. Like it's a fun way to really lean into it. And it just, again, it creates a conversation when you can do something fun like that. We've also done sticky note practices where we talk about how your body language is like a whiteboard. It's just that you're not aware that you're writing messages to everybody else in the gym. And so we'll give them sticky notes to put on the back of their teammates when they see them communicating something positively or negatively, non-verbally. They just write it with a marker, piece of tape, and they put it. And at the end of practice, they take their jersey off and they just see all the sticky notes, that the things that they were communicating that they may not have been aware of. That also creates a great conversation. The last one here is we will put kids on blast from other teams all the time when we're watching film. So we played a team in the postseason last year that had one girl who had terrible body language and response to failure. And we talked about that and looked at how do her teammates respond to her when she misses a shot and doesn't get back on defense. And what's that feel like as a team? So it wasn't personal, but I mean, part of it, we wanted to get under this girl's skin a little bit because it did affect the team, but it did create sort of a safe space where we weren't talking about anybody in our room necessarily, but it gave us language the rest of the postseason to say, we called it the ugly sweater. We're not putting on ugly sweaters like that. Ugh, when we're trying to win basketball games. And that was our cue, when somebody would make a mistake, was like, hey, get that sweater off. What are you doing? And they would just laugh and then we would move on from there.
Yeah, I love this. There's so much great examples in that for support. I just want to tie back to a logical consequence that often I see around body language, because you still have to have the support and accountability. And oftentimes we just say, hey, when your body language is unacceptable, right? You're choosing in that moment, right? You're going to have to step off until you can reset yourself and get back out there. Because if it's unacceptable, we know that we understand the effect that it has on the team and the team's play, right? So it's just remembering, just like, hey, you have a choice right now. You're choosing to go reset, right? And then when you're ready, you let us know and we'll try to get you back in there. So I think it's important that we have that consequence as well. And we're holding athletes accountable in this. All right, so I'm going to take a break in the conversation with Betsy, Nate, and I, because honestly, we could not keep our conversation anywhere close to 30 minutes. So we decided to break this up into 2 episodes so that we could continue to unpack other scenarios and behavior challenges coaches face. So in our next episode, we're going to unpack how to discipline when an athlete talks poorly about a teammate or coach, talks back to a coach, is not giving effort in a drill, is not giving effort in a game, ignores a teammate or coach, disrespects a teacher or professor, misses practices, team meetings, or team culture time, or the last one we're going to finish with is bullying a teammate. So we're going to work through all those scenarios. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Now, if you enjoy our content, you might have thought about how else TOC can help you, your team, and your organization. Well, since 2017, I've been coaching and consulting on team culture, leadership, and character development in sports. I work with teams, clubs, and athletic departments to develop stronger cultures and better coaches through online courses, on-site facilitation, and one-on-one coaching. If that sounds like something your organization needs, you can reach out to see if we're a good fit. Thanks for tuning in to the Coaching Culture Podcast. If you found this episode valuable, we'd love for you to leave a review, but most of all, share it with athletes, share it with your coaches or friends. These episodes make for great conversation starters. I can imagine even just sharing this one with your leadership team, your leadership council, your athletes, right? To have a conversation around accountability and helping them to understand why you don't yell, scream, or do those types of things, but also why you need to hold them accountable. Anyways, don't forget to subscribe to the Coaching Culture Podcast so you never miss an episode.